The wind whispers over broken columns, curling through the ruins of Persepolis like a forgotten breath. Dust clings to stone where once the feet of kings walked, where golden doors swung wide to receive the rulers of the earth. He was called the King of Kings, a man cloaked in silk, shadowed by immortals, crowned by gods and burdened by the memory of his father. Xerxes I, a name that resounds through the folds of time with grandeur, with fury, with contradiction. To some, he is the tyrant who burned Athens and wept when his bridges failed. To others, he is the symbol of power stretched too far, of an empire that could command the sun to rise over 1,000 provinces, but could not still the tide of defiance in a narrow mountain pass. And yet, beneath the myth, there was a man, a son, a king, a ruler who shaped the destiny of millions, who stood at the helm of history's greatest empire and watched it flicker like a flame in the wind. This is not just the story of a conqueror. It is the story of ambition and fragility, of power and its limits, of footsteps in palaces and footprints left across continents. This is the story of Xerxes. And if you find meaning in the rise and fall of empires, in the quiet drama of history's greatest figures, consider joining us. Subscribe and let the past breathe once more. In the heart of the Achaemenid Empire, where gold gleamed like sunlight and walls spoke in cuneiform whispers, a boy watched his father rule the world. Xerxes was not born into simplicity. His earliest memories were shaped by the echo of sandals on marble floors, the scent of cedar oil and incense drifting through the halls of Susa. He saw Darius not just as a father, but as a force of nature, an emperor who commanded rivers to be bridged, mountains to be crossed, nations to kneel. The court of Darius was not a place for idleness. It was a forge, and every prince a blade yet unsharpened. There were tutors and generals, priests and advisors, each one watching, evaluating, whispering in corridors gilded with lapis and turquoise. Xerxes listened, he watched, and though he was not the eldest, he learned to carry himself with stillness. It was not noise that earned power in Persia. It was gravity. Darius had many sons, some older, some more boisterous, but Xerxes carried something the others did not: legitimacy from his mother, Atossa, daughter of Cyrus the Great. The blood of kings ran doubly in his veins, and though it weighed heavily, it also elevated him. The empire did not just expect greatness, it demanded it. He grew tall and calm, with a gaze that did not flinch. He studied the tongues of subject peoples, Elamite, Babylonian, Aramaic, not to master them, but to understand them. For to rule an empire was not to speak from a throne. It was to listen through walls. There were moments of boyhood, yes, chariot races in the courtyards, the thrill of climbing forbidden terraces. But even those were watched, remembered, recorded by servants who served the future as much as the present. Every smile, every silence would be weighed in time. The air of court life was heavy with expectation. Festivals dazzled with music and light, but they were not just celebrations, they were declarations of power. Each gold cup, each embroidered banner, was a message to every satrap and visiting envoy: the center holds. And Xerxes? He was the center in waiting. He often sat at his father's feet during council, watching the flow of decisions, the calculation of war and tribute. Darius was meticulous. He ruled not with raw force, but with the slow, grinding gears of administration. The roads he built stretched like veins across the empire, and his scribes were as feared as his spearmen. But for all his brilliance, Darius was haunted. Greece had refused to bow. Marathon was a scar he did not speak of, but it ached beneath the surface. Xerxes felt it, not in words, but in the pauses. The way Darius stared across maps longer than needed. The way he grew still when Greek envoys were mentioned. To grow under such a father was to live in the shadow of grandeur and incompletion. Xerxes learned that legacy was not simply what one inherited, it was what one repaired. In the gardens of Susa, beneath hanging willows and the chirr of desert insects, he would walk alone, silent, thoughtful. He studied more than war. He studied silence, diplomacy, the way his mother moved through the court like a quiet queen, wielding no sword, yet obeyed by all. His friendships were few, his confidants even fewer, not because he lacked warmth, but because trust in the house of kings was dangerous currency. As he matured, the whispers began that Darius was growing old, that the throne would pass soon, that the older sons resented the quiet favorite. There were plots. There are always plots. But Atossa held sway, and Darius, despite the counsel of tradition, looked to Xerxes with eyes that saw not just lineage, but vision. One evening, when the lamps flickered in their alabaster bowls and the court dined beneath painted stars, Darius called his son to him, not as prince, but as heir. He spoke softly, so only those near could hear. The crown is not given, it is taken, with burden, with blood, and it will not make you free. Xerxes said nothing, but he nodded. That, too, was a kind of promise. He was named successor shortly after. It was a move that rippled through the empire like a hidden tremor. Provinces shifted loyalties. Generals reconsidered allegiances. The court, always watching, adjusted its bow. And still, Darius ruled. Still, the old lion burned. But age is a tide that no king can command. And in time, the lion would fall, and the shadow would become the light.
By divine will, I claim this crown.
The sky over Persepolis held a pale, burnished hue, as if the heavens themselves had dimmed to match the weight of the moment. Darius was dying. Not in sudden collapse, not in dramatic pain, but in the slow, deliberate withdrawal of a ruler who had given the best of himself to an empire that always demanded more. His hands, once calloused from the grip of reins and scrolls, trembled now, even beneath layers of silk. His breath came thin and brittle, like dry papyrus ready to tear. The court had already begun its dance of veiled panic. Advisors whispered in corners, satraps sent messages cloaked in ritual, and servants moved with eyes lowered, as if to avoid witnessing the unraveling of power itself. Xerxes watched. He did not pace, he did not sigh. He sat by his father's bed and listened to the silence between words. Darius, in his final days, spoke of rivers, of roads, of stone, not of regret, not of Greece. Perhaps it was pride, perhaps it was mercy, or perhaps in the end, even kings grow tired of unfinished wars. And then, one morning, the guards outside the royal chamber shifted their stance, just slightly. The physician did not exit with his usual scroll. The inner doors remained closed, and a hush swept through the corridors like a cold wind. Darius the Great was gone. The empire did not mourn with wails or ashes. Persia did not allow grief to loosen the threads of rule. Instead, it turned, immediately, imperceptibly, to the next bearer of the flame. Xerxes did not cry. Not here, not now. He stood in the golden hall of Persepolis, beneath winged bulls and watchful lions, and received the crown not as a triumph, but as a weight. The coronation was not spectacle. It was ceremony, sacred, stark. He bowed to Ahura Mazda, the god of truth and light, and swore the oaths of a king, to guard the order of the world, to punish the lie, and to hold the empire as both sword and shield. Gold was set upon his brow, incense lit. The priests chanted in Old Persian, voices echoing through pillars carved to resemble eternal flame. And just like that, Xerxes became Shahanshah, king of kings. But the crown did not wait for grief to settle. The fire beneath the empire had already begun to flicker. Babylon, ancient and proud, had stirred. The city that once ruled the world did not kneel easily. Though brought under Persian rule generations earlier, its people remembered their kings, their gods, their pride. And now, with the throne in transition, they saw a crack in the empire's armor. Whispers turned to defiance. Statues of Xerxes were toppled. Temples refused to offer tribute. A new king of Babylon was named in the dark. It was not merely rebellion. It was insult. For Xerxes, still newly crowned, it was a test, not of diplomacy, but of fire. He did not hesitate. The army that had stood waiting, an organism of cavalry, archers, and footmen drawn from every corner of the empire, was summoned. Xerxes donned armor that bore the twin eagles of his line, not borrowed from Darius, but forged new. The past honored, but not worn. The march to Babylon was swift, not cruel, not wanton, but deliberate. The message was clear. No one, not even Babylon, could challenge the will of the King of Kings and remain standing. The gates of Babylon were breached, the rebels captured, their names erased, their memory drowned in silence. And then came the act that would echo through the centuries. The golden statue of Marduk, patron god of Babylon, was taken down. It was more than iconoclasm. It was statement. Xerxes would no longer carry the title of King of Babylon as his father had. That age was over. Persia would not kneel to old gods. Some called it blasphemy, others called it clarity. But everyone understood. Xerxes was no caretaker of tradition. He was its fire. And still the murmur spread. Not in Babylon now, but in the soft hills and sea-salted valleys of Greece. The memory of Marathon had never faded. Not for Persia, certainly not for Athens. The cities of the Hellenes were divided in council, but united in defiance. Even after Darius's passing, they remained unconquered, their defiance stoked by stories of resistance and honor. Xerxes knew it. He knew his father's campaign had left unfinished business, an open wound that pulsed across the empire's western horizon. But to act rashly would be to fall into the same trap. So he waited and prepared. He called forth engineers, shipwrights, scouts. He spoke with his generals not in shouts, but in long, deliberate meetings that stretched into the candlelit hours. The campaign to Greece would not be a simple march. It would be a tide. And while plans were drawn, the court in Susa changed shape. Servants shifted. Advisors aligned themselves anew. Some still questioned his right to rule, favoring older sons of Darius, quietly, carefully. But power does not yield to lineage alone. Xerxes saw through veils of politeness. He understood where loyalty bent and where it threatened to break. In one quiet evening, a general who had grown too bold was dismissed. The next day, another was promoted, a man of lower birth but sharper mind. The message rippled through the court like smoke from a snuffed flame. Xerxes did not rule through fear. He ruled through awareness. But ruling was not enough. He had inherited the world. Now he would shape it. And so the call went out. Across the empire, from Bactria to Lydia, from Egypt to the shores of Thrace, soldiers began to move. Not as raiders, not as mercenaries, but as pieces in something grander. An invasion unlike any before. But even then, even as the gears began to turn, Xerxes returned often to Persepolis, to the halls Darius had begun, to the halls where inscriptions spoke of divine order and justice. There, beneath the carved reliefs of royal processions, he watched stone rise. He commissioned new works, greater, taller, more intricate. Columns carved like trees, animals entwined in eternal battle. Stairs so broad a procession could move as one without breaking formation. This was his vision, not just to conquer, but to endure, to leave behind something more lasting than fire. But war would come first, and it would not be quiet. For in the hills of the Hellenes, warriors trained with memories sharp as spears. And across the sea, Athens watched. The city loomed like a memory carved into stone. Babylon. Not just a city, but a myth still breathing, its ziggurats rising like steps to the gods, its walls thick with stories and old wounds. No land under the Persian sun matched it for age or pride. Conquered, yes, but never fully tamed. And now, it defied him. Xerxes stood beneath a red sky, the smoke of rebellion already curling against the horizon. Word had arrived in Susa like a serpent in the dark. Babylon had named a new king. a man who dared to wear the crown, who dared to reawaken the rituals of ancient sovereignty. The people had chanted his name in temple courts. Priests had anointed him with oil once reserved for kings of old. The temples had turned. The river gods had been invoked. It was not just mutiny. It was resurrection. And for Xerxes, it was betrayal. He did not raise his voice. He did not storm the chambers of council. Instead, he walked alone that evening along the polished corridors of the palace, where firelight flickered on the walls and shadows stretched long behind him. He had ruled for mere months, but already the world tested his grip. So he did what his father would have done, but with his own precision. He summoned his generals. Not all, only the necessary. He laid out the plan, fast, overwhelming, and symbolic. This rebellion would not be crushed with swords alone. It would be erased. By the time Xerxes reached Babylon, the rebellion had grown bold. Priests chanted against the false king of Persia, while the usurper rode through the streets in a borrowed chariot, mimicking the kings of yore. Citizens cheered. The old gods watched from soot-darkened altars. But none of it would matter. Xerxes did not announce his arrival with fanfare. His army came like a sandstorm, sudden and vast, devouring the outlying towns before Babylon even raised its gates. Siege towers moved forward in perfect rhythm. Archers blanketed the skies. And somewhere within the assault, Xerxes watched, his gaze fixed not on the walls, but on the Tower of Marduk rising behind them. That was the soul of Babylon, and souls could be broken. The siege was not long. The city, though proud, had grown used to memory more than steel. Its defenses, ancient, groaned under modern pressure. In less than a month, the gates opened, first from within, then by force. Xerxes did not gloat. He walked into Babylon not as a guest, but as judgment. The rebel king was found hiding behind a shattered altar, his hands stained with ink and oil, symbols of mock coronation. He was dragged into the square where the real kings had once stood, and before a silent crowd, Xerxes pronounced him nameless. His death was not recorded, only his disappearance. But Babylon was not done. A second revolt surged like a second breath. Again, they rose. Again, they named a king. Again, they believed they were Babylon still. And this time, Xerxes answered not with punishment, but with annihilation. He ordered the walls breached anew. He stripped the temple of Esagila of its treasures. And then, with deliberate finality, he commanded the golden statue of Marduk, the idol of gods and kings, to be taken down. It had stood for centuries, the embodiment of Babylon's divine right to rule. But Xerxes would not share the divine. Marduk was carted away, his priests silenced, his rites ended. And with that, the spell was broken. Never again would Babylon rise in rebellion. Not because it feared, but because it no longer believed. The title King of Babylon, once proudly claimed by Persian rulers, was struck from the lists. Xerxes would not wear a borrowed crown.
He would be the king of kings, or nothing. He returned to Susa not with plunder, but with silence. The court knew better than to offer lavish celebration. There was no glory in punishing a dream, only necessity. But the empire understood. Xerxes had not merely put down a rebellion. He had severed the last tether to a past that no longer served him. Babylon became a city of shadows, revered but hollow, a jewel left in the dark, and in its silence, Persia's dominance became complete. Yet, not everyone celebrated. In the corners of the empire, among the scholars and the priests, questions began to stir. Had the king gone too far? In destroying Babylon's gods, had he also unbalanced something deeper? Even among the Magi, keepers of the sacred fire, there were murmurs. Persia's greatness had always rested on harmony between peoples, between the new and the old. Xerxes, in his quest for purity of rule, had shattered that balance. But he did not flinch. Kings who feared murmurs built nothing. He focused instead on what lay ahead: Greece.
The western provinces, long weary of the unruly city-states across the Aegean, now pressed for decisive action. The memory of Marathon still burned. The Ionians, Greeks under Persian dominion, remained restless. And among the generals there was hunger. Hunger for resolution, for revenge, for legacy. And so Xerxes began to plan. Not with haste, but with a patience born of certainty. Babylon had tested his legitimacy. Greece would test his reach. The preparations were immense. Engineers designed a bridge of ships to cross the Hellespont. Canals were carved to avoid treacherous waters. Supply routes mapped and fortified. Every detail measured not by what Persia needed, but by what would be remembered. This would not be a campaign. It would be a reckoning. And yet, in the quiet moments of those years, Xerxes returned often to the stone cities of his ancestors, to Persepolis, to Susa, to the mountain tombs where Darius now lay in carved eternity. He stood once before the inscription at Nakhshe-Rustam, the tomb of his father etched into the cliff like a frozen hymn. He read the words as if hearing them again for the first time. Darius, speaker of truth. Darius, lord of order. Did he approve of what his son had done? No voice answered, only the wind over stone. And so Xerxes turned away. He had inherited an empire. He had claimed it with fire. Now he would stretch it to the ends of the earth. The sea does not rush, it gathers. And so did Xerxes. Long before a single soldier marched westward, the idea of war began to ripple across the empire, not in shouts, but in whispers, in lists, in parchment and ink and measured breath. To punish Greece, to avenge his father, to finish what was left undone. But vengeance alone is not a strategy, and Xerxes was not a man of impulse. What he envisioned was not a raid, not a campaign, but a tidal wave of empire itself, rolling westward until the defiant little cities of the Hellenes were washed away beneath it. He began not with warriors, but with builders. At the narrow neck where Asia meets Europe, a new ambition took shape, a bridge of ships to span the Hellespont. It had never been done. To command land was one thing. To command the sea, to walk across it, was another. Yet Xerxes would settle for nothing less. He ordered his engineers to moor ships side by side, hundreds of them, lashed and anchored with wooden planks laid across, a floating causeway for the might of Persia. But the sea had other plans. A storm shattered the first attempt. Waves tore through the cords, ships buckled, snapped, vanished beneath foaming crests. Xerxes watched it happen from the cliffs, silent, still. And then, in a moment that would become legend, he commanded the sea to be punished. 300 lashes, chains thrown into the waves, a declaration not of rage, but of will. Even the gods would bow. The second bridge held. Elsewhere, the preparations gathered momentum. Across the satrapies, from the Indus to Egypt, men were summoned, not in dozens, but in nations. Archers from Assyria, charioteers from Bactria, skirmishers from Ethiopia, Lydians in bronze helmets, Indians bearing bows taller than a man. From every corner of the known world, soldiers arrived in ranks that stretched beyond the horizon. This was not merely an army. It was the empire made flesh. The immortals, the elite guard of Persia, stood at the heart of it. 10,000 warriors who never diminished, for each fallen man was replaced before the dust had time to settle. They marched not with noise, but with presence. Polished armor, spears gleaming, faces calm.
And at their center, the golden throne of Xerxes, carried on a platform draped in purple, flanked by fan-bearers and guards, a moving palace on the march. Behind him followed scribes and surgeons, architects and priests, historians to record, map-makers to redraw the world, astrologers to read the stars over every battlefield. Xerxes did not go to war alone. He brought civilization with him. Even the animals bore witness to the scale of the plan. Camels loaded with provisions, horses bred for battle, exotic beasts kept as omens, symbols of dominion over nature itself. As the army moved, roads were widened, wells were dug, supply depots established at intervals precise enough to nourish the march like blood through veins. And yet, for all its magnificence, the war machine was not without hesitation. At the court, voices rose in dissent. Among the elders, a magi, the surviving counselors of Darius, some questioned the wisdom of invading Greece again. They spoke not of fear, but of memory. Marathon still burned behind their eyes. They reminded Xerxes, Greece was small, yes, but stubborn, wild, untamable. A nest of quarrelsome city-states who fought each other until they suddenly, violently, did not. They feared not defeat, but humiliation. And Xerxes listened. He did not silence them. He did not lash out. Instead, he called a council. The great court gathered, princes, generals, satraps. There, under golden ceilings and inlaid tiles, the king rose. He spoke of his father, Darius, and the sting of unfinished conquest. He spoke of empire, not merely as possession, but as destiny. The Greeks had not only resisted, they had mocked Persia. They had defied the order of the world. He would bring them peace through strength. But more than that, he would bring memory. His name would echo. His deeds would bind the empire tighter than any tribute could. And when he had finished speaking, there was silence. Then assent. Even the skeptics bowed. There was no turning back. Before departure, rituals were performed, sacrifices made to Ahura Mazda, the wise lord. Fires were lit and prayers whispered through the halls of Persepolis and Susa, through temples nestled in mountain passes and desert valleys. The king stood beneath the stars, his arms outstretched, not as a conqueror yet, but as a servant of destiny. He knew what must come. And so, at last, the army began to move. It was a sight that lived only in the mouths of poets thereafter. As the great host departed Sardis, moving toward the Hellespont, the earth trembled beneath it. Dust rose like morning fog. Rivers swelled with the water drawn to feed it. It took days for the army to pass a single point. Villages emptied to watch. Farmers climbed hills just to see the silver of armor gleam in the sun, the long spears catching light like the spines of some divine beast. Xerxes rode not ahead, but among them. He was not hidden. He was not separate. He wanted them to see him, the king, the source of their command, the center of the storm. He crossed the bridge of ships not as a man, but as empire incarnate. And once he set foot on the western shore, he paused, not in hesitation, but in gravity. He knew where he was standing. Europe, a land that had refused Persia's peace, a land where blood would answer pride. Yet, as he stood at the edge of Asia, looking toward the spine of mountains and hills that guarded Greece like a fortress, he did not smile. He did not yet claim victory. The gods are known to favor the bold, but also to test them. And in the distance, beyond the valleys and olive groves, beyond the murmurs of Delphic oracles and Spartan blades being sharpened in silence, the resistance waited. For now, it was a whisper, but soon it would speak.
The pass was tight, too tight for an empire. Thermopylae, the hot gates, a narrow cleft where the mountains drop toward the sea, and the land narrows to a corridor no wider than a chariot's turn. Here, the stone walls rise like silent judges, and the wind carries the scent of salt and pine. Xerxes stood before it, high on the cliffs, surveying the bottleneck that now defined his ambition. This was not where he had expected to be challenged. He had crossed rivers with bridges of ships, dug canals through mountains, carved order across continents, and now a sliver of earth, this slender gate, dared to halt him. The Greeks had gathered, not in thousands, but in hundreds. 300 Spartans.
and with them, Thespians, Thebans, and allies who had chosen to make a stand. It was laughable in scale, absurd in arithmetic, but war is not a ledger, and pride can weigh more than numbers. For 3 days the Persians advanced, and for 3 days they bled. The immortals, Xerxes' elite, were sent first, disciplined, silent, deadly. They marched like shadows through the rocky pass, their spears gleaming, their shields a forest of bronze. But the Greeks did not move. They did not flinch. They fought like stone come alive. Their phalanx held, shoulder to shoulder, spear to shield. No man yielded. The narrow ground denied the Persians their advantage. Cavalry was useless. Archers could not see. The cliffs funneled everything, ambition, noise, steel, into a corridor of death. And in that place, Leonidas stood, the Spartan king, old by soldier standards, weathered, calm. He did not roar. He did not boast. He fought. And Xerxes watched. Each night he asked for updates. Each morning he sent new waves, Medes, Scythians, more immortals. But still, the Greeks held. It was not just strength, it was belief. They fought with the madness of those who had already accepted death, not for land, not for gold, but for something harder to name. Xerxes, for all his reach, understood this, and it unsettled him. He sent envoys, promises of reward, of kingship, of survival. Leonidas declined. No, refused, with the calm of a man who had counted the cost and paid it in advance. The Persians began to murmur, not in fear, but in confusion. How could such few men hold the line? Were they enchanted, favored by strange gods? No, just prepared. But fate does not only serve the bold, it also favors the betrayer. A local Greek, eager for coin or safety, slipped into the Persian camp one night and knelt before a captain. He spoke of a path, a goat trail that twisted through the hills and over the cliffs behind the Greek position. A chance to surround, to suffocate. Xerxes did not smile, but he nodded. At night, under torchlight, a detachment moved out, quiet, swift, led by the traitor's trembling hand. By morning, the trap had closed. Leonidas knew. His scouts had seen the movement. There was no escape now, no victory, only choice. And so, he made it. He dismissed the bulk of the allies, ordered them home, but he and his 300, and a few who would not leave, remained. Not to win, to witness. What followed was not battle. It was defiance made visible. The Spartans broke formation, surged, retreated, reformed again. They fought like wolves, controlled, efficient, terrifying. Their swords snapped. They used teeth, fists, the broken handles of spears. Leonidas fell, but the wall of Greek bodies still stood. By mid-morning, the last of them lay quiet.
The pass was taken. The way to central Greece lay open. The empire could now advance. But something remained in the dust, something Xerxes could not march through. It was the echo. The world would remember Thermopylae not as a Persian victory, but as a Greek stand. And Xerxes knew it. His army continued, yes. Towns fled before him. Boeotia bent the knee. The path to Athens widened. But in every village, in every glance from a fleeing shepherd or trembling elder, Xerxes saw it. They will not forget the hot gates. Still, the war had not been for Thermopylae. That was a curtain rising. Athens was the prize, the pulse of Greek pride, the city of thinkers and warriors, temples and fire. It had to fall. As the army advanced, Xerxes rode with them now, not just as a sovereign, but as a presence. The soldiers looked to him. The officers whispered of omens. They needed assurance, victory, a cleansing. And so the king prepared to take Athens. He entered the empty city under a sun that burned with fierce indifference. The Athenians, warned and wise, had already fled, evacuated by sea, their families taken to safety. But the city itself stood undefended. Its temple still rose, gleaming. The Parthenon, proud and unfinished, caught the light like a taunt. Xerxes ordered it burned. The Acropolis, sacred rock of Athena, set aflame. Columns cracked, statues melted, roofs fell. Smoke curled into the sky, black and slow, rising like a funeral for a civilization. And in that moment, Xerxes stood beneath the charred bones of marble, watching the fire consume a people's pride. It should have felt like triumph, but it didn't. The city was silent, too silent. No cries of surrender, no kneeling citizens, only the hiss of fire, the crumble of stone, the whisper of something unresolved. The Athenians had fled, but not broken. Their spirit had not died in the blaze. Xerxes turned away. In the days that followed, he ordered a throne built on the cliffs above the bay of Salamis, where his fleet had gathered. From there, he would watch the final blow. The Greek fleet, cornered, frightened, leaderless, would be crushed. He had the numbers, he had the ships, he had the sea. And yet, in the distance, in the shallows, the Greek ships did not scatter. They waited. Like Thermopylae, only wetter. Like the Spartans, only this time with sails. The smoke hung low over the Acropolis. Not a column moved. Not a statue blinked. Athens was dead, or so it seemed. The flames had licked the marble, had blackened the sacred stones of Athena's shrine, had danced through the market stalls and academies with a kind of slow, deliberate cruelty. The Parthenon skeleton stood scorched, its unfinished elegance crumbling in silence. Below, the streets were empty. No laughter, no traders, no clamor of sandals on stone. Only ash, only wind. Xerxes walked those streets not as a stranger, but as an emperor among ghosts. He did not rush. He moved with the heavy calm of someone fulfilling a necessary sentence. The city had defied Persia for too long, insulted it with ideas of freedom, of resistance, of something called democracy, and now it paid its price in flame. And yet, as he passed through the sacred heart of Greece, something tightened in the air. There were no cries, no pleas, no conquest in the usual sense, only the eerie absence of defeat. The Athenians had taken their most precious treasure, themselves, and vanished into the sea. A city hollowed, but not conquered. Even in its destruction, Athens refused to kneel. Xerxes understood this, though he said nothing. In his long hours seated atop the great throne he had built overlooking the bay of Salamis, he pondered not the ruins behind him, but the waters ahead. There, beneath the haze of salt and sun, the Greek fleet lingered. They should have fled. They should have shattered, but they hadn't. And now they waited. Themistocles, that was the name the scouts brought back. Athenian commander, cunning as a snake, clever as any scribe in Susa. He had been the architect of the evacuation, the conductor of silence. And now he stood behind the Greek triremes, hidden from view, sharpening something. Not swords, plans. Xerxes, always methodical, had brought the navy in force. Ships from Phoenicia, from Egypt, from the Ionian coast. Hundreds, maybe more than 1,000. They stretched across the water like a bronze net, sails furled, oars at the ready. The Bay of Salamis was narrow, another cursed funnel like Thermopylae. But this was water, and water was Persia's domain now. Or so it seemed. On the morning of the assault, the Persian fleet surged forward. The order was given. The tide moved. Ships pulled out like iron teeth across the channel. The king watched from his throne, golden and cold, set high above the cliffs. He would see this victory with his own eyes. But the Greeks had chosen this place for a reason. Salamis was tight, treacherous, winding. The Persian numbers, once a strength, became a snare. Ships crowded each other, oars tangled, orders vanished in the wind. The sun rose higher, and with it, the Greek strategy. From behind the outcrops and islets, the Greek fleet sprang. Triremes carved through the water like daggers, each ship quick, light, lethal. They rammed, retreated, struck again. The Persians, too tightly packed, could not maneuver. Their size became their downfall. From his vantage point, Xerxes could see the shape of failure forming. One ship burning, another struck amidships and split. Shouts, splashes, cries in unfamiliar tongues. The sea turned bronze, then red. Below, his admirals fought to recover order. They signaled, they screamed, but it was too late. The fleet had become a chaos of iron and fear. And amid it all, Themistocles, silent, calculating, moved his ships like a maestro. It was not numbers that won the day. It was placement. The trap had been perfect. By nightfall, the Persian fleet had lost not just ships, but the illusion of inevitability. Salamis had not merely been a defeat. It had been humiliation. Xerxes did not rage. He did not throw goblets or strike servants. He sat, quiet, still, watching. Even in failure, he understood the shape of legacy. The Greeks had struck a blow, not fatal, but deep. And worse, they had struck it while he watched. But the war was not over, not yet. The land army still stood unshaken, occupying much of Greece. Athens still smoldered. Xerxes could rebuild his fleet, try again. He had time, he had men, he had gold. But the wind had changed. The campaign had become exposed, vulnerable. There were rumors, always rumors, that rebellion stirred in distant provinces, that Egypt was watching, that Babylon still remembered. To remain too long in Greece, now that the momentum had fractured, would be to invite collapse elsewhere. And so Xerxes made the most difficult decision a king of kings can make. He left. He left the war in the hands of trusted generals. Mardonius would lead the remaining forces. The Persian flag would still fly, but Xerxes would return to the heart of the empire. Some would call it retreat. Others would call it wisdom. He called it preservation. And yet, as he departed, his ships reconfigured, his guards close, his advisors careful, he could not shake the lingering feeling that something vital had slipped through his grasp. Not just Athens, but certainty. The kind of certainty Darius had once held when the empire was still expanding, still glowing with youth. That certainty now cracked like a statue scorched by fire. Xerxes would never again burn a city the way he had burned Athens. He had seen what it left behind. Not surrender, but myth. And myth, once lit, never dies. At first light, the sea looked calm, too calm. The air was still. The water shimmered like molten glass. Gulls circled overhead, silent, as if they too sensed the weight beneath the surface. Xerxes sat high above the cliffs of Salamis, a throne fashioned from gold and wood, placed deliberately to watch a moment that was supposed to seal his legend. His guards stood motionless around him. Scribes readied tablets. Advisors murmured predictions of swift and total victory. Below, the might of Persia stirred. Hundreds of ships fanned out across the narrow channel, long vessels, curved and sharp like the talons of hawks. Painted hulls, bronze-tipped rams, rows of oars flashing in rhythmic precision. They came from Phoenicia, Egypt, Cilicia, Ionia, from every part of the empire where sea met shore. 1,000 ships, perhaps more. It was an ocean of authority. The Greeks, few and desperate, had retreated to this bay, or so it seemed. They floated in tight formation, near the jagged coastlines and hidden coves of the island. Smaller, slower, less. But then again, so had Thermopylae. And once again, they had chosen their ground well. Themistocles had sent a message, a trap disguised as surrender. A whisper carried through neutral envoys that the Greeks would break ranks, flee, surrender, just give them space. Xerxes, who had built canals through mountains and chained the sea, believed in action. He ordered the attack, and so it began. Persian ships poured into the bay like floodwaters. Their hulls surged forward. Oars churned the Aegean into foam. Archers stood ready on deck. Swordsmen braced behind them. Victory, it seemed, was moments away. but the narrow straits betrayed them. There was no room to maneuver. The fleet pressed inward, ship after ship, squeezing into tight channels with no space to turn, to retreat, or even to breathe. Orders clashed, signals blurred, and just as confusion began to ripple through the ranks, the Greeks sprang their trap. From behind rocky inlets and coastal bends, triremes shot forward, sleek, fast, perfectly positioned. Themistocles had not waited for flight. He had waited for crowding. Greek ships slammed into the Persian line with brutal elegance. Their bronze rams hit at angles designed to splinter wood below the waterline. They retreated just as quickly, darting back into safe corridors while the Persian fleet flailed. Above it all, Xerxes watched. His golden throne was shaded, his robes immaculate, his face unreadable. But in his eyes, something shifted. He could see it, how the battle twisted, not in slow defeat, but in sudden collapse. The sea was not on his side. Persian ships began crashing into each other, flanks scraping, masts snapping, oars shattering. Their numbers, once overwhelming, became a curse. The narrow bay, so perfect for entrapment, turned on its masters. The Greeks had planned not just to survive, but to win. And they were doing it. From the cliffs, the king saw a Phoenician vessel sink in minutes, its crew leaping into the water like insects from a drowning hive. Another, from Cilicia, turned too late and was struck by a Spartan prow. A wave of fire followed, then smoke, then silence. And in the heart of it all, Themistocles moved like a shadow. His flagship danced between the wreckage, not in triumph, but in precision. Every strike counted. Every maneuver echoed strategy honed in council halls, not just training grounds. Xerxes said nothing, but his knuckles whitened around the carved arms of his throne. The scribes beside him hesitated. Their tablets stayed still. This was not the victory they had come to record. Hours passed. The sun rose. The water darkened with ash and wreckage. Bodies floated, twisted and still. Persian survivors clung to debris, their cries muffled by the wind. And still, the Greeks held the bay. By sunset, it was clear. The empire had lost. Not because it lacked force, but because it had faced something that force could not bend: strategy in the service of desperation. Salamis was not a battle. It was a message. That even empires must learn where they do not belong. That arrogance, no matter how gilded, can be caught in a tide. That water, so easily commanded to carry bridges and ships, will not always carry ambition. Xerxes stood. He did not weep. He did not scream. He did not curse the gods. He turned.
150 to 160 words per minute, reduced to 130 for quotes. He returned to camp, issued orders, quiet, efficient. He would not remain in Greece, not now. He would leave Mardonius behind, a capable general with enough men to maintain Persia's grip. But Xerxes, the king of kings, would withdraw. The throne was disassembled, the royal guard reassembled in silence. Ships were prepared, not in flight, but in shadowed departure. The campaign was not over, but it had changed. And Xerxes understood better than most. When the tide turns, it does not ask permission. That night, from the hills beyond Salamis, the fires still glowed. Greek songs echoed faintly across the bay. Laughter, the kind of laughter born not from joy, but from disbelief, that they had survived, that they had won. And in the quiet of his tent, beneath silk embroidered with stars and lions, Xerxes did not sleep. He watched the flame of a single lamp flicker. In it, he saw Athens still burning in memory. He saw ships cracking like bone. He saw something he could not name. The turning of an age, perhaps. The narrowing of the future. The reminder that even kings, even gods made flesh in the stories of empires, must eventually retreat, not just from battles, but from certainty.
The long road home was not lined with banners. No cheers echoed from the mountain passes. No trumpet marked the king's return. Only wind, only dust, only silence. Xerxes crossed back into Asia not as a failure, nor as a victor, but as something in between, a shape half-formed. The weight of Greece still clung to his shoulders, not in loss of territory, Persia still held much, but in the loss of illusion. For the first time in his reign, something had resisted and survived. And now he returned to Susa, the jewel of the empire, with his empire intact, yet different. The city welcomed him with ritual, not joy. The gates opened, priests bowed, servants lowered their heads. But behind the ceremony, there was caution. Everyone watched the king. Everyone waited. Would he rage? Would he retreat into pride? Or would he rebuild? Xerxes answered with stillness. He entered the palace not with speeches, but with a quiet command to resume the rhythm of rule. The halls of polished stone, the columns painted with lions and lotus blossoms, the canals that laced the gardens, these were his now to inhabit again. And in the heart of that elegance, the king began to change. He spoke less in public. He delegated more. Where once he had stood in judgment at court, now he listened from behind veils. He no longer needed to be seen to be known. He ruled by presence alone. The defeat at Salamis had not destroyed him. It had refined him, like gold beaten thinner, but made more luminous in light. In time, he ordered new construction at Persepolis, Darius's unfinished dream. Where his father had left outlines, Xerxes carved completion. Where there had been potential, he laid permanence. He did not turn his back on war, but now he invested in stone. New halls were built, sprawling, symmetrical, awe-inspiring. Columns rose like petrified trees, fluted and immense, their capitals carved with bulls and griffins. Doorways stretched to the height of 2 men. Staircases unfolded like tapestries of stone, their sides etched with the procession of nations. Elamites, Medes, Babylonians, Egyptians, Greeks, each carved in profile, bearing tribute. They bowed, they walked, they watched. An empire in bas relief. And atop it all, the image of the king, serene, eternal, untouched by dust or flame. In these carvings, Xerxes was more than man. He was time given shape. But behind the scenes, something had shifted. His court grew more opaque. Advisors came and went, their names remembered only in scraps. Ambition flourished in corners. Family rivalries sharpened. The power at the center, once so dazzling, had grown remote. The king had retreated into marble. Even his family noticed the distance. His sons, Darius, Hystaspes, and others, were raised not just as princes, but as heirs in waiting. Yet Xerxes rarely embraced them. He taught through observation, not affection. He gave them tasks, tutors, and silence. Perhaps he feared what Darius had once feared, that nearness weakens rule. Or perhaps the war had hollowed out some hidden place inside him. Outside the palace, the empire still thrived. Roads were maintained. Tribute flowed from India, Bactria, Lydia. Satraps governed with order, some fair, some feared. But whispers grew louder. Egypt murmured again. The Greeks had not forgotten their defiance. Babylon, though quiet, remembered everything. Xerxes responded not with force, but with monuments. 1,000 stonemasons carved his name into cliffsides. In Old Persian, in Elamite, and Babylonian script, 3 tongues echoing one message. I am Xerxes, the great king, king of kings, king of this earth far and wide. He was inscribing memory itself. But monuments do not listen. And in the absence of war, intrigue crept in like ivy. The court filled with eyes. Ambitious cousins, jealous brothers, cunning officials, all waiting, all watching. Assassins could hide in compliments. Treason could wear perfume. And truth in the palace became slippery as oil. Xerxes knew. He had inherited an empire forged in conquest, but he would pass on an empire that required containment. He no longer sought new lands. He sought to preserve, to hold what had been gathered. But even as the king built upward, some invisible force pulled inward. He spent more time in solitude, in gardens shaded by sycamores, in chambers cooled by stone pools. He took to walking at dusk, alone, except for a few silent guards. He would pause at fountains, staring into their still surfaces, as though trying to read the future in the reflection of his own face. What did he see? Perhaps a ghost of Athens, perhaps the wreckage of Salamis, or perhaps nothing, only himself, older, heavier, more myth than man. And yet, he ruled. For over a decade after his return from Greece, Xerxes remained the axis of the Persian world. He answered rebellions. He punished disloyal satraps. He approved roads, aqueducts, temples. He continued to build. But never again did he march west. Never again did he challenge the winds. Instead, he carved immortality in stone. At Persepolis, he built the harem palace, delicate and luxurious for the women of the court. He ordered a new hall of 100 columns, vast enough to house the gatherings of nations.
And in the inscriptions, he reminded all who would read, "By the grace of Ahura Mazda, I hold this land. I rule not for myself, but for the order of the world." It was not pride, it was justification. But even kings must sleep, and even kings must wonder, in the final hours of quiet, what might have been.
The western satrapies report unrest.
More levies are needed.
And what of the eastern grain shortages?
Time in the palace does not pass like time elsewhere. It drips. Quietly, slowly, like melted wax down a bronze sconce. The war had ended, at least on maps. Greece had been left behind like a half-finished sculpture. What remained was rule. Not glorious, not grand, but necessary. And Xerxes, now older, slower, still tall but faded around the eyes, became not the king of conquest, but the king of preservation. The quiet years. But quiet does not mean peace. Within the stone courtyards of Persepolis and Susa, the empire continued to breathe, rhythmic, controlled, but full of currents beneath the surface. Xerxes, no longer driven by campaign roads or the urge to stamp his seal on foreign lands, turned inward. He became a figure both present and distant. His voice still passed through edicts, his image still graced walls, but the man himself grew elusive. A presence glimpsed at ceremonies, glimpsed at dusk, always flanked by the immortals. There were no more great councils of war, no royal decrees of vengeance. The chatter of court shifted to marriages, appointments, whispers of succession. That last word, succession, hung over everything. Xerxes had many sons, and though Darius, named for his grandfather, was considered heir, ambition is not born of appointment. The palace corridors grew thick with tension, brothers eyeing brothers, advisors pledging loyalty with smiles too perfect. The queen mother, Atossa, once a guiding voice in court, was long gone, and without her, the balance shifted. The harem, once silent, became political. Wives and concubines maneuvered for favor, not for themselves, but for their sons. One whisper from a eunuch, one forged scroll, one invitation to dinner, these were now the weapons of war. And Xerxes knew. He had walked among soldiers. He had seen blood on snow. He recognized the scent of strategy, even in perfume. But he did not intervene. Not yet. Instead, he built. Persepolis grew year by year into something both real and unreal, a city of ceremony, not life. Columns taller than trees, reliefs carved with such delicacy they seemed to breathe. Throne rooms so vast, voices disappeared in them. And everywhere, the king. Xerxes depicted as unbending, eternal, serene, hand raised in blessing, eyes forward, always. No trace of Greece, no memory of burning ships or narrow passes, only order. But images lie. Behind the carved eyes was a mind still haunted. In the evenings, when the sun poured golden light into the western halls, Xerxes would sit alone near the water gardens, silent, unmoving, watching the ripples. He rarely spoke. When he did, it was brief. His words had become leaner with age, like a sword stripped of decoration.
Once, a visiting satrap asked what victory meant. Xerxes answered without turning, not having to ask anymore.
Outside the palace, the world kept shifting. In Egypt, unrest simmered again. The Nile was patient, but the people were not. In Bactria, a minor noble plotted rebellion before being silenced with coin. In Babylon, the silence grew heavier. Not dangerous, just bitter. And in the West, always the West, Greece remained unbowed. Athens rebuilt. Themistocles fell, then vanished. Sparta flexed. Cities argued, allied, divided. But Persia watched now from a distance, no longer willing to press too close to the fire. What had once been ambition had become caution, and caution had become fatigue. In Susa, the seasons shifted softly. Spring brought almond blossoms to the gardens. Summer bathed the stone in firelight. Autumn carried with it the sand and rain. Winter crept through the corridors like an old memory. And through them all, Xerxes endured. He still held audiences, though shorter. He still issued decrees, though fewer. He celebrated New Year with the same rites, sacrifices to Ahura Mazda, processions of gold and tribute. But there was less joy, less ceremony for its own sake. The king had become a symbol, and symbols do not sleep easily. Inside, something tightened. He aged, but not in the usual way. His skin bore fewer lines than his years suggested, but his eyes were tired. Not tired like a soldier, tired like a man who had walked the entire width of a continent and found no edge. He became cautious, suspicious even, trusted few, listened more to silence than to speech. And in the silence, others moved. In the palace, his son Darius grew more visible, confident, respected. The court whispered that his time would come soon, that Xerxes would name him formally, that the torch would be passed not with fire, but with soft, inevitable light. But shadows lengthen before nightfall. One evening, as lamps were being lit along the corridors, a slave was found poisoned in the harem. Nothing unusual, they said. A personal quarrel, a private matter. But the next week, a scribe disappeared. And then a general was reassigned without cause. And then an assassin was caught before his blade met its mark. Xerxes knew the signs. This was not random. The palace was turning in on itself. He increased his guards, moved more often between chambers, removed certain names from documents without explanation. But he did not panic. He had lived too long to fear the knife, only the silence after it. What haunted him most was not death, but uncertainty. That what he had built, what he had inherited, what he had preserved, might vanish not in rebellion nor battle, but in subtle collapse. The kind that comes not with fire, but with forgetting. In the hall of 100 columns, he once stood before an inscription written in 3 tongues, his own declaration of kingship, of faith, of divine favor. He traced the letters with his fingers. He had ruled the greatest empire on earth. He had burned Athens. He had crossed the sea. He had returned. And now he waited.
Not for victory, not for applause, but for legacy.
It did not come with horns, or battle cries, or the crash of empires. The end came, as it so often does, in silence. The palace at Susa shimmered in the heat of midday. Beyond its high walls, the world spun as usual, scribes copying decrees, servants moving with practiced rhythm, courtiers whispering over goblets of wine. The fountains sang their quiet songs beneath the cypress trees. Gold glinted on domes, incense curled in hallways. And somewhere, behind stone and shadow, a blade was drawn. Xerxes had ruled for over 2 decades. He had outlived rebellions, wars, the glory of fire, and the echo of failure. He had built monuments that kissed the sky, and walls thick enough to silence doubt. But no wall can block ambition. His court had become a hive of invisible threads, spies listening to whispers in courtyards, eunuchs passing messages with gestures instead of words, advisors smiling too long, and sons restless, watching, sharpening their futures against their father's crown. The king had grown used to tension, but tension is not the same as betrayal. And betrayal does not always knock. It was Artabanus, they say, a noble once trusted, a man of quiet demeanor and practiced obedience. He knew the palace like a blood vessel knows the heart. Some say he feared the growing power of Darius, the king's eldest son. Others suggest darker motives, revenge, greed, prophecy. The truth, like breath on a mirror, fades too fast to catch. Xerxes had retired to his private chamber. The day had been unremarkable. Petitions from satraps, a revision to a tax code, a letter from Sardis. He had spoken little, but his mind had been sharp. At dusk, he had asked for sweet figs and chilled wine. Then he had waved his servants away, and the door had closed. What happened next was quiet. A step, a shadow, steel, and then the stillness of something ending. The King of Kings died not on the battlefield, nor in the blaze of his own myth, but in the solitude of his own palace, by a hand that had once bowed to him. He died not as a conqueror, not as a tyrant, but as a man, vulnerable, human, alone. The court did not announce it at once. Word spread slowly, like dusk creeping across marble floors. The guards sealed the inner chambers. Advisors assembled in haste, unsure whether to mourn or maneuver. The women of the court wept, but softly, carefully. The sons of Xerxes were summoned: Darius, Hystaspes, Artaxerxes, each called to the heart of the empire to claim what remained. And just like that, the world that had revolved around one man began to divide. There was no single funeral, no great mourning across the provinces. The empire was too vast, too old, too practiced in survival. Xerxes had not ruled like Cyrus, had not conquered like Darius, but he had endured, and so would the empire. In Persepolis, scribes added one final line to the royal inscriptions: Xerxes the Great, King of Kings, departed this earth. His body was taken slowly along the royal road, past deserts and rivers, past cities built in his name, past soldiers who had once marched to Greece, now old or buried, past traders and craftsmen who only half remembered the tall, silent figure they once glimpsed from a distance, and finally to Nakhshe-Rastam.
There, carved into the cliff beside his father, his tomb waited.
not grander than Darius's, but equal. The door framed by stone guardians, the chambers dark and cool, cut deep into the heart of the mountain. They laid him there. No crown, no ceremony, just a man returned to stone. The walls bore his name in 3 tongues. They spoke of the lands he ruled, the gods he honored, the justice he preserved. They did not speak of Thermopylae, or Salamis, or the fire that once ate the bones of Athens. Nor did they speak of betrayal. Legacy is not truth. It is sculpture. The empire continued. Artaxerxes would claim the throne after bloody trials. The satrapies would shift. Greece would rise. Persia would waver, then roar again under other names, other kings. But something had changed. Xerxes had shown that even the mightiest could be slowed, not by armies, but by the weight of dreams. That conquest has its limits. That memory is not a throne, but a mirror. And in the centuries that followed, his name would echo strangely. To the Greeks, he became a villain, a symbol of Eastern pride undone by Western valor. To the Persians, a complicated shadow, brilliant in ambition, clouded in end. But history, in its quiet way, remembers him best not for how he died, but for the world he tried to command. He built roads across deserts, bridges across seas, palaces from mountains. He tried to hold the sun in his hand, and when it burned, he did not drop it. He simply stood longer in the dark. That is not failure. That is the mark of a king. And so, Xerxes rests, not in fire, not in glory, but in stone, a name carved beside the winds. The wind still sighs across the cliffs of Nakhche Rustam. It weaves through tombs carved into stone, through names weathered by centuries, through silence deeper than any army's march. And in that silence, if you listen, you may still hear it. A whisper, a footstep, a name, Xerxes. He ruled not in the blaze of first glory, but in the long echo after it. He stood in the shadow of giants and tried to cast one of his own. He bridged seas, burned cities, raised palaces that still catch the sun. And yet, he is remembered not for triumph, but for reach, for what he dared, for what resisted him, for the truth that even kings must bend. History remembers him with sharp contrasts, tyrant and builder, destroyer and dreamer. But beyond the judgment of victors and the caricatures of drama, there was a man, born of empire, shaped by silence, lost not in battle, but in the folds of time. Xerxes, a name carved into cliffs, a shadow in the marble of Persepolis, a reflection in the sea he once chained. And perhaps, in the end, that is enough. Thank you for joining us on this journey through dust and memory, through stone and story. If this past has stirred something in you, curiosity, awe, wonder, consider subscribing so more voices from history may rise again. Because even now,
In the ruins, in the quiet, in the breath between empires, the kings are still speaking.